Well, this is exciting. Hopefully you're there with your HTB group, gathered together in one way or another and ready to learn. And we're really excited to begin this series, Rebuilding the Walls, all based out of the book of Nehemiah. And you may have seen the short introduction video in which I just encouraged everyone to take on the challenge of reading the book. So you may have done that already, having arrived at your HTB group. But if you haven't, why don't you do that over the next few weeks? We are going to specifically look at the first 6 chapters over the course of these 6 weeks. But you can carry on reading to the very end and learn even more as we get to know this book and learn and grow and challenge one another from it. So let's get stuck in. A few years ago, I got up at 5 a.m. in the morning. It was dark as I was waking up, but then the sun began to rise. I pulled on my running shoes. I put in my earphones and played a bit of Coldplay, and off I went for a run. And I was in Jerusalem, which is an amazing privilege, and I ran around the walls of Jerusalem, all around the walls of the old city, not just around the whole city. That would have been even bigger. And I loved doing it. I called it the Nehemiah run. And as I was running around these walls of Jerusalem, I found myself praying that we might see another time just like Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is famed really primarily because he really led the campaign to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, the walls that I ran around as I was on my jog, they're not exactly the walls that Nehemiah built. I'm sure there's bits of rubble and there's all sorts of archaeological sites that will have included some of the stones that Nehemiah and his team of people would have used to build the walls of Jerusalem. But nonetheless, there was this sense and this theme in me, which is true for all of us, that though this book is about the physical rebuild of the walls of Jerusalem centuries ago, it speaks to us prophetically today that God is intent on building his kingdom. He wants to see his kingdom established here on earth as it is in heaven. Now, that's not just about Jerusalem and the walls, but Nehemiah knew that that was a picture of the glory of God. And we're going to discover as we read chapter 1 that his heart broke over the reality that Jerusalem lay in ruins. And as it lay in ruins, it reflected the reality for people as they walked past Jerusalem. Is that God dead? Does that God even care? Is God still alive or not? It made people question the glory of God. It made people question whether God was even there. And so that's true for us today. Many, many people in our society would question whether God's even there or not. If he is there, they've got no idea who he is. And when they look at what's going on and maybe some of their experiences, even of Christianity, they look and think that it's in ruins. The rubble is there to be seen, but there's nothing that's alive. I know that that's not true, and I hope that you do too. If you don't, maybe you'll discover that over these coming weeks. But the call of this book is for us to think through what would it look like for us to build the walls of God's kingdom in our day. How would that impact this city? How would that impact this land? And could we play our part in that? If you're up for that adventure, then I want to invite you on it. Let's start digging into this right now in chapter 1. In a moment, we're going to have a chance to read through it together. But before we get to that, the first thing to note is that Nehemiah's name literally means the Lord's comfort. Now, you may think, oh, that's a nice thing, a nice little thing to start with. But actually, the meaning of names is really important and was particularly important in Hebraic understanding. So in Nehemiah's day, every name carried real meaning. It often carried a sense of what happened in the birth or what people felt prophetically for that child's life. It may have carried a sense of where they were from. For Nehemiah, he's called the Lord's comfort. That's the definition of his name. And so we see throughout this book the theme again and again coming that Nehemiah wants to bring comfort to the people of God and ultimately comfort to the world as well. Why? Well, let's just look at the context again before we get to reading some of the details. And if you ever study theology, often in an early lecture they'll say, context is everything. That's one of the kind of 101s of theology. And so as we look at this book, understanding the context of what was going on and what this story is telling is really important. Now, I'm not going to do all of that, but just as a brief thing for us, to understand where we're up to when we hit Nehemiah is really important. And the reality is this, in broad terms, is that God had invited people to follow him. It began with Abraham, and Abraham began to follow God, and God made promises to Abraham. And then through the generations, God kept turning up, making promises, saying that I want a people for myself, not just to keep for myself, but so that those people will reflect my glory and declare my glory on earth. So that when people encounter those people or see those people, they will think, wow, God is alive. Who is this God? I want to know him too. So it's almost like they would lift up the name of Yahweh, of God, all over the earth. That was his desire. And as the people of God go on in their journey, which is all captured in these pages, through the Exodus, and they have a season in Egypt, and then Moses brings them out, and then into the promised land, and then they go through highs and lows with judges and kings who lead them. Some do it brilliantly, and some don't do it so well. And these people of God go through moments of really following God, and then moments of moving away from God. And some of the prophets, who are also captured in the pages of this book, begin to say to the people of God, if you don't pursue God, then you're going to lose your way. And his favor will be lifted from upon you, and all kinds of things will begin to happen. Some of the prophets began to say, listen, if we don't stay close to God and demonstrate who he is to everyone, the world's going to lose out. And what's more, we're going to get invaded because God won't be represented like that. And that's exactly what happens. Around the year 605 BC, the Babylonian Empire, the strongest empire on the planet at the time, marched into the surrounding area around Jerusalem, into Judah. And they begin to encamp and to occupy the land. And this empire aren't interested in just making friends, they want to take over the world. And they want to take it over in pretty brutal ways. There's all sorts of stories about how the Babylonians did that, and it wasn't pretty. They killed many people, they took over many lands. The brightest and the best, they would often steal for themselves, take back to Babylon and try and make them like themselves so that they could build their empire with the brightest and the best at the center of it. That's in the story of Daniel, if you've ever read that. Daniel was carried back as one of the brightest and best from Jerusalem, and they tried to assimilate him and make him like themselves. And so Babylon is occupying the territory, and a few years after they arrive, they totally sack Jerusalem. They level it. They take it to the ground. They destroy the walls. They burn buildings. There's all kinds of things that happen. They take people into exile. They leave a few there who they couldn't care less about. And the whole thing is totally destroyed. And God's people have stripped away from them everything that represented the glory of God. The temple's gone. Jerusalem's ruined. The walls are broken down. And everything they found identity in, everything that they built to show how great God was, is totally destroyed. Fast forward a few years, and the Babylonian Empire crumbles to the Persian Empire, who become the strongest. And the Persians are a little bit more lenient. They let some of the Israelites go back to the Promised Land, to Jerusalem. And so some of them go back, they begin to rebuild. People like Haggai, Zerubbabel, Ezra, these are all people you can read about in the Bible. And they begin to return to rebuild houses and then the temple in Haggai, and to re-establish something of what was destroyed decades before. About 140 years after Jerusalem was destroyed is when we join this moment in Nehemiah chapter 1, where Nehemiah is wanting to find out what's going on in Jerusalem. And he asks a few people who have been there, and he finds out. And I want you right now, if you haven't done already, pause the video, and as a group, why don't you just read through chapter 1, notice a few things as you go. Let's really get to know this book, and then we'll start learning. So there's so much in there that we could explore, but I want us just to focus in on what it means to begin to catch vision today. How do we begin to catch vision? And we can learn so much from Nehemiah, and we're going to focus on two things that happen in this chapter that are going to help us to begin to catch vision for rebuilding the walls in our day. And the first thing is this, Nehemiah sees. If you want to catch vision, you've got to begin to see. I love this quote from David McKenna, who wrote a great book called Becoming Nehemiah, which you might want to get on Amazon if you want to dig deeper into some of this stuff. But David McKenna writes this: one of the defining characteristics of effective leaders is the gift of being first-class noticers. They see things that others do not. And that's exactly what's going on for Nehemiah. That would describe him really well. It's one of his gifts and his skills. Maybe you feel like you see a lot, maybe you don't notice much at all. But Nehemiah is a first-class noticer. One of the reasons we know that is because at the end of this chapter, Nehemiah says, I was cupbearer to the king. Now, being cupbearer to the king is an area of service within the courts of the king. It's a very trusted position. Because as the cupbearer, one of your jobs was to notice what's going on around the king, to make sure there's no conspiracy, to make sure there's no one who's getting up to anything they shouldn't be getting up to around the king, and to be tasting from the cup and tasting the food to make sure no one's poisoned anything that's going to kill the king. And so if you're doing that job, you're brilliant at noticing things because you don't want to die from that poison either. And you're close, you're trusted. You've got integrity, otherwise the king would have you nowhere near and wouldn't let you to be in that role. And so we know that Nehemiah had great integrity, that he was trustworthy, and that he was a first-class noticer. He could see things. Now, he could see things in the natural, and sometimes, maybe you're one of them, there are some people, some of the best leaders I've come across, and they can walk into a room and they can look at a person, they know immediately how that person's doing. They can walk into a space and immediately read the room, like, is this a hostile environment? Is this an environment where people are going to learn and grow, or what's going on? And it's almost like they see stuff, and they see maybe beyond just what's visual, but they understand, they discern stuff. Now, whether you think you're a leader or not, whether you would put yourself as a leader like David McKenna says, or like we're naming Nehemiah to be, that doesn't really matter. I think you are. I think God can use you to influence anywhere. And if that's the simplest form of leadership, then you can lead. Whether it's your family, whether it's in your home, with whoever you live with, on your street, in your workplace, wherever it is you can influence. And so at one level, you are a leader. But even if you will still want to disqualify yourself and say, I'm not a leader, all of us can still learn to notice and see more fully. And maybe God wants to show you something around your life. This is where vision begins to get caught. We notice something. We see a situation and we think, that's not right. That's not fair. We see something on the news and we think, somebody's got to do something about that. We walk past a situation on the street, a person. We notice a company. We can notice all kinds of things and see things and begin to think, is there something in that for me? Why is my attention being caught by that? And when we become aware of that, we grow our awareness of what we're seeing. Often God will use that to help us notice what it is he wants to show us. We can all grow at seeing. And even if you think you can't, just begin by praying and saying, God, will you help me grow in discernment? That's a gift of the Holy Spirit that God may want to give you, that you can discern and see things, perhaps that others haven't seen, that he wants to birth in you so that it begins to put into motion you capturing a vision of rebuilding the walls of his kingdom in our day, in your life, through what he's called you to do. So we need to be first-class noticers. Now, as we see, there's something I just wanted to address really quickly, that as we begin to think about this seeing and how we go about it is really important. And it's this, it's the Stockdale Paradox. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but sometimes we can see things and we think, yeah, I want to change the world. I started this series, Rebuilding the Walls, and now I'm going to change the world. You're going to finish this session and everything is like, you can do it. And you're optimistic and you're hopeful. And that's really good. I want to encourage you with that. You may already have something that's burning on your heart that you want to stop this video, tell everyone about right now. And that's great to have hope and optimism. But we may need to have a balance of that too. And that's what the Stockdale Paradox is all about. Stockdale Paradox is named after Admiral Jim Stockdale, who found himself in a prisoner of war camp. And while he was in that prisoner of war camp, he observed something really interesting. He recognized that obviously everyone in that prisoner of war camp wanted to get out. That was the vision they wanted to catch. They needed to survive and get out. And he noticed that those who had great optimism and hope, like we're going to be out by Easter, or we're going to change the situation right now, when that didn't happen, perhaps according to how they hoped it would happen, they lost so much of their optimism that they often really struggled. Sometimes died sooner because they lost hope, they gave up, they gave in, they were unable to stay committed towards the course that they were hoping for. So it's not that we don't want to be hopeful and optimistic, but his paradox was we need to hold that, but the Stockdale Paradox also says, but we need to be absolutely honest about the brutal facts. We need to be real and honest about the brutal facts. And if you can hold both of those things as a paradox, holding them together, then you can build the longevity to move forwards towards realizing a vision. You won't just burn out on the hope and optimism, but you'll have an understanding of the brutal facts. So as we see things, we begin to recognize, okay, why is it like that? What's actually going on? If there's a situation that's caught your heart and you've seen it, and someone's got to do about that, maybe that's me, then you begin to discover it and you understand the facts alongside your optimism to bring about a change there, and you're going to get momentum in towards catching the vision that maybe God has got for you. I wonder how you see that in your life. Whether you think you've got the balance of the Stockdale Paradox going well in your life. Are you just one of these people who are optimistic about everything, but maybe get very disappointed when you don't see some stuff? Or are you so into the brutal facts that there's no optimism at all and you think that nothing can ever change? Can you build that balance? Why don't you pause the video right now and have a discussion in your group about that? Just talk to one another and ask the question, how do you get on with that Stockdale Paradox? Are you on this end or this end? And how can you bring balance? Have a conversation. So if we want to catch vision, the first thing is to see. Become a first-class noticer. Start doing that this week. Open your eyes to the things that are going on around you. But secondly, in Nehemiah's experience, we need to start feeling. Feeling. Now, it's captured right here in verse 4 of chapter 1. Having heard the news about the fact that the walls of Jerusalem lie in ruins, Nehemiah is seeing that situation. Even though he can't physically see it, he sees what's going on. That's why he's asking the question. And his response in verse 4 is, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. There's this deep moment of feeling. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. Maybe when was the last time that happened to you, if ever, where you've actually seen something and you've felt it so deeply that you've mourned, you've been in grief about it, it's been so in your heart, and it's maybe even caused you to weep. And maybe you've even turned that into a period of fasting and praying and turning it to God, which is exactly what Nehemiah does. He feels it. So having seen the situation, he now feels it. It goes deep into it. Ministry, wherever you're doing that ministry, and that's not just a church-based ministry, it could be wherever God's put you. Ministry often starts in this moment, where you've seen something, now you feel it, and you know that something has to happen as a result of it. And that feeling goes deeper and deeper. I love this quote by John Maxwell, where he says, "People do not care how much you know until they know how much you care." So you might get all the degrees in the world and have a PhD in this, that, and the other, and you might have all the knowledge, but really what people want to know, if you're going to bring about a change, is, do you actually care about this thing? And here's the reality. You can see when somebody feels. I'm sure you've seen that in your life. You get captured by somebody's speech, or when they're talking about something, and you're not just hearing the words, you can see what they're feeling. And so there's something deep in them that's carrying this vision forwards. And that's a reality. So actually the very best of leaders, again, whether you qualify yourself as leader or not, I'm just going to start qualifying you as one because I know that God wants to use you to influence. So wherever you position yourself in that, the very best of leaders feel deeply the thing that they're moving towards. If they don't, their followers can see it. It's almost like, well, they don't really care, so why should I? And they don't go that way. So this is a key point in beginning to develop a vision in our lives. We see something and then we begin to feel it and we begin to respond to it, just like Nehemiah. And he wept and he sought God. And that feeling often develops from a broken place, from sometimes a place of hardship or suffering. Sometimes you can face things that are difficult and suddenly that embeds an emotion in you. And suddenly that emotion begins to give birth to vision. That feeling is a good thing, even if it's uncomfortable. And I'm sorry if it's been uncomfortable for you at times in your life. But sometimes the most difficult things that we face are the things that birth new vision in us. And I think for Nehemiah, he recognized, having never actually even been to Jerusalem, we've got no evidence that Nehemiah had even been to Jerusalem at this stage in his life. He just knows the heart of God. He can see the situation and recognize that these walls in ruin are not a good thing. And when he sees that, he then feels it deep in his heart and begins to weep. Now I want to encourage you to have a conversation again together. as you begin to think what it looks like to catch vision. And for some of you, vision will come easily. You know what it's about already as you've been watching this. Others of you, it'll be a sense of, I don't know what God's calling me to. I don't know what vision I've got. I don't know what it looks like for me to build the walls of God's kingdom in my day. That's okay. That's why we're doing these sessions. That's why we're going on a journey and we're together, learning together. But as you have this discussion right now, I'd love you to talk and share with one another where those things of feeling have happened for you. What are the things that really matter to you? What are the things that you're passionate about? What are the things that when you've seen them, you've felt them too? And maybe you've already begun to act on those, having caught them. Just share stories of that. And by doing that, you're going to get to know each other even better as a group. But you're also going to begin to hear vision around you. And one of the amazing things that happens is when we verbalize vision, when we begin to give language and words to something we've been thinking or feeling, it becomes even more real and we're more able to get hold of it. We have moments where we say a sentence and we go, yeah, that's really true. That's really true. I don't know if you've ever done that. Where you say a sentence like, oh yeah, that's really what I mean. And that's just because we begin to articulate it. So as a group, why don't you begin to do that right now? And as you get to the end of that, take some time to pray together and ask God to help you see things in the week ahead. Ask him to set things in the feeling of your heart so that he might begin to birth and catch new vision in you as we all seek to build the walls of God's kingdom.